productive pathways of our system, the more closely we imitate natural processes, the lower our expenses are. Kid you not. Nature has never spent a dime on managing itself. Now, the thing is, our plant associations, all these populations, they're dependent and they're dependent on and they're conditioned by the physical factors of their site. The soil type, the elevation, the aspect, the direction that faces the sun, their latitude, whether it's crushed rock, rich organic matter. In this case here, we see a lot of north-facing slopes without much sun, so there's a lot of permafrost underneath. The disturbance type, all these things affect the populations of plants, and they affect individual plants within that system. Various different ways which we've talked about through the weeks. Now, one of the phases, one of the significant phases of regeneration is recruitment. Individuals of a population are recruited from somewhere. They're seed from somewhere else, or they're from the site itself, in a seed bank in the soil. Either by propagules, I used the word propagules instead of just seed. It's either from seed or from root parts, from stump sprouts, from root suckers, rhizomes. There's all different ways, or from pieces of the tree itself. We'll talk about all these. So anyways, there's some sort of recruitment of individuals to a site. There's a site that's been disturbed. It's perfect conditions for a certain suite of plants. So to know what your site is like today, what it might look like after a strategic disturbance, and then know what the plant communities, natural plant communities of your area are, if you time your entry into that site just right, you will radically enhance your system's ability to thrive on that particular site. Once we've had recruitment of individuals to a site, now there's growth in height and in mass. Trees, obviously, there's a lot of girth that occurs. This requires light, it requires space, it requires a certain amount of nutrients, a certain amount of moisture, and that may not be enough for some individuals. The individuals are the ones that have some sort of thing that makes them not quite fit for that particular site. There might be whole entire species that are not fit for that particular place. And one of the things about this growth of height or mass, what we remember from a few weeks ago, maybe it was even last week, is look at the left side of the picture and the right side of the picture. There's only about so much basal area of woody plant material that a site can support. It may either be lots and lots and lots of small stems or fewer larger stems. And that's another thing that we want to keep in mind is to how do we want to have our site look? Do we want to have fewer larger stems or more smaller stems? That depends on your management goals and objectives. Do we want to have closed canopy forest so there's no grass underneath, or do we want to have it semi-open so there's grass underneath? Those are all decisions that we need to know. This all affects the regeneration of our system. Some of these individuals will persist for years in the understory until something happens and they become recruited to the overstory. Classic here, we see a lot of eastern hemlock. We've seen this picture from New Hampshire before. Other individuals at first, when recruited to that site, they just take off. They kick off like gangbusters. They reach the overstory, they dominate, they become dominants or co-dominants in that particular forest class, and they thrive. And sooner or later, though, some individuals are restrained by some sort of limits, whether it's not enough sun, not enough water, or it's just a mechanical crowding. We've seen pictures in some of the previous webinars where a beech tree had gone right through another tree, sending its branches right through another tree until it completely shaded it out. Beech is also notorious for doing that with its roots. It will have it send its roots into the various different strata between layers of other roots and eventually take all the moisture away from it. So there may be individuals that somehow get restrained, and sometimes it's whole entire populations, and then they start to fall apart and die. And we see trees here now starting to die. This is the stem exclusion phase. It's thinning. Now, plants will maintain their populations over time, And groups of these different populations will maintain themselves over time by the process of regeneration. Regeneration includes these four very specific steps. It's the reproduction, dispersal of those propagules, germination of those propagules, then establishment of that stand. If your system, if the system that you set up, see if that's the next one, right, regeneration, both sexual and asexual, is an ecological process ensuring the development of successive generations of plants and populations of plants in a given landscape. If your plant and animal community cannot reproduce itself and persist in the environment, by definition, it is not regenerative. These two slides right here, I just want you guys to stop and look at it. If we want to claim to call any type of agriculture that we're doing regenerative, it has to be able to perpetuate itself in perpetuity with basically natural processes. That's how the word is defined. You know, this is a pumpkin. A pumpkin is a pumpkin. You can call it all kinds of different names, but it is what it is. This is a regeneration in an ecological system. Is the continuing development of successive generations of plants and populations of plants. Think about a cornfield somewhere. A cornfield by itself, whether you're GMO and chemicals, or whether you're biological and you're using minimal chemicals, or whether you're certified organic, whether you're biodynamic, horn twirling, adding compost, all this kind of stuff, a cornfield is not and cannot be a regenerative agriculture system, period, unless it is it's a phase within a successional development of a system that has a known successional pathway that's based on the site, the region, the rain, the soil types, the plant communities, etc. As a phase and a part of a successional pathway, a cornfield can be part of a regenerative system. But a cornfield, if you're just growing corn, all those different other qualifiers that I had, if it's not part of a successional pathway, it's not regenerative, can never be regenerative, according to the definition of what regeneration is. This, however, is regenerative agriculture. This was the place in Italy, Trentano, and a couple different other villages where I was at last summer. Here's some of the houses. It's the main road that goes up. Obviously, it's a footpath. These are the different pastures where they would graze their animals. There's the lookout tower. All of this, without any human intervention whatsoever, has reproduced itself over and over and over again. Pears, grapes, asparagus, walnuts, chestnuts, hazelnuts, plums, apples, in wild profusion all over the place. This is a regenerative system. It's reproducing itself. It will continue, has been continuing for thousands of years. It's a regenerative system. Sexual reproduction, of course, is where the male and female gametes combine, form a zygote. And this is part of the magic of why sexual reproduction is so cool, is we get genetically different offspring. That is key for us when we are living on a dynamic planet. The seasons are never the same. They may fall within certain norms. Once upon a time, it was thought that we live in a climate that's bounded by a series of norms, but the more we learn, the more we find out that what we think is normal is an anomaly. Weather and climate has been doing this all over the place for zillennia. We need to know how to adapt to our environment on this planet, and the answer is in natural systems. They have been adapting, evolving, changing through time, migrating through space and through time for as long as there have been plants and animals on this planet. And as long as we understand how that works, how that happens, we can now chart a path as well as we can through uncertainties of the future. And sexual reproduction and the variation that introduces is the secret that makes it all work. Just going to show this briefly, but there's this whole huge, bunch of different things that have to do with the reproduction in the plant. A lot of things have to fall into place really well in order for it to happen. The plant has to grow. becomes sexually mature. It has to go through a phase first. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Becomes sexually mature. It has to make vegetative buds, which makes the leaves that will eventually turn into stems. It has reproductive buds. And all along the way, different things can affect this. You know, your plant does not live in isolation, and no matter how much research the university does and tell us what the ideal conditions are that we're supposed to create and promote in our system, it ain't going to happen. It's always different all the time, and there's always something, you know, taking out your flower, your fruit buds, or this, that, and the other thing. You'll see some pictures of that later on. Then there's pollination. All kinds of issues can happen with pollination. You can lose the fruit. You can lose, you know, whatever where the seeds are held. Then somehow that seed has to disperse. What were the natural seed dispersal techniques for the various different plants? And since I'm talking about agriculture, restoration, agriculture, I'm talking about food plants. What were the primary dispersal techniques of those seeds that allowed those plants to keep propagating in natural plant communities? Then there was some sort of seed bank or propagule bank where plant parts or seeds are stored for a certain period of time, whether it's 1 year, 5 years, however long that lasts. There's going to be predation that occurs. Those seeds somehow have to germinate. The conditions have to be right for it to germinate. You can throw, you know, a seed on the ground, and certain seeds have to have contact, full contact with bare dirt. There has to be some sort of disturbance to get soil to seed contact. Other seeds require sunlight in order for them to germinate. I don't know if you knew that about your garden lettuce. That lettuce seed needs to have contact with the sunlight before it sprouts. So plant your seeds, sprinkle them all out in the row, and don't do anything to them yet for a little while. Give them 5 minutes or so before you ever cover them up. Just cover them up lightly. Then once they germinate, now there's this bank of seedlings that are all growing together. They go through that growth phase. Now they're in the stem exclusion phase. Now we have established plants and established groups of plants. They can start to do this whole cycle all over again. There's a lot of things going against our plants and our plant communities, preventing them from reproducing successfully, but they have all kinds of tricks up their sleeves. They're adapted to our sites and or reasonably closely adapted to our sites, and they want to live too. Take a drink of orange juice there. There's some plants that reproduce quite strongly asexually. This is a photograph of aspens on a hillside. I picked it because you can clearly see that this right here, there's a boundary between this particular clone and this particular clone. Aspens, Lynn ought to be real familiar with these up north. You can have a group of aspen trees or poplars, whatever you call them in your particular region. There's 10,000 stems, ramets. They may still all be the same plant. They're all connected by the root. One stem turns into 3 stems, 5 stems, 10 stems. It just keeps spreading and spreading and spreading until it bumps up into another clone. And then this leaves 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6, 7 different clones here. But that's probably all one plant right there. Almost all woody plants are capable of some sort of cloning. And if it fragments itself into numerous individual stems, that particular genotype takes up more growing space. It can put down more roots. It can grab more nutrients, more moisture, whatever critical elements that it might need. This is I think this is either sweet gum or tulip poplar. I just took a picture of this down in North Carolina last week. That just keeps this root keeps going through the ground and sprouting up, and you can see how the root continued over here, continues going that way. So instead of just having one stem with one group of roots around it, you've got one genetic individual that now has multiple stems, multiple spots where it sends down roots, and it keeps going for more and more and more. It now gives itself the ability, it can grab stuff, nutrients from all over the place. Now look down here. What do we see? We see a little crease in the ground. So this little creek running by here, it's probably wetter down there. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just send a root down that way and grab a little extra water? They've done, I've seen research where they've done, taken some radioactive dye and put it in roots of trees down by a creek and seen that same radioactive dye show up mile and a half, 2 miles away. So here's that tree. It's all a single genetic individual that had its root. You can kind of see the lump here. You see it sticking out of the ground, but to see the lump under the leaves goes all the way down to the brook. It's getting extra water, and it's hundreds of feet away from the water source. Oops, wait a minute. Where did it go? Ha. How? There's another slide that's missing, but that's all right. One of the things, how this increases its ability to propagate itself. First of all, there's a number of individuals of itself. That's not reproduction. It's just cloning yourself. It's just more of you. The genetic material that's you, the genotype, doesn't carry on. However, if this tree happens to have 55 stems, there's 55 stems that can now flower in all different places. And if it stretches over a quarter of a mile from the creek all the way up to the uplands, it now has a broad area where it can have individual flowering parts, and it can exchange genetic material with any number of different plants. It increases its capacity for sexual reproduction later on by having more total stems. So the individuals go through this metamorphosis, and so don't populations as well. Individuals, they'll go through a process of maturation, and you can see here just some. We got our first. The seedling, the seed has to germinate. It has specific requirements to germinate. Specific hot, cold, wet, dry, acid, alkaline, and then it grows. And it becomes older and more mature. Now, what's interesting about woody plants especially is that the maturation doesn't occur simultaneously in all meristems, which seems really weird. Is that certain buds and certain stems can grow older at a faster rate than other stems, which seems pretty weird and fascinating. There's just other stages which show on these trees from little seedlings. Imagine this little teeny tiny thing, some of the seeds the size of a pinhead. They have to somehow survive through all these different phases until they can be these gigantics dominating a landscape for thousands of years, thousands and thousands of years. So back to the meristem again. Meristematic tissue is undifferentiated tissue. It's just like these glumps of cells, and if you put it under a microscope, the best scientists in the world cannot tell what it's going to turn into. They might be able to tell that it's a red cabbage, for example, but they can't tell you what part of a red cabbage it will become. That's the undifferentiated meristem, meristematic tissue. The duration of the juvenile phase can be really different between species, and even within the species, fast-growing, sun-loving trees such as paper birch and Virginia pine, they tend to reproduce sooner than shade-tolerant trees like American beech and hemlock, sugar maple. It's not always the case, and actually, of course, there are individuals within the population that won't be the same because we've got that sexual variation going on. Some of these birches might take a long time to reproduce. That's generally selected against by the site conditions in areas that are heavily dominated by birch, which is typically wind and fire disturbed sites are dominated by birch, and that they colonize the bare exposed soil, grow really, really fast. They don't grow very long, 65 to 120 years in the case of paper birch, and then they rot and fall over. So generally speaking, they're much faster to come into production than like beech or hemlock. However, even within beech and hemlock, we can genetically monkey with that. And what's interesting is in trees, woody species, the adult phase, when you start having reproductive organs and start producing seed and fruit and whatnot, is more closely related to the tree size than the age. And that's why horticulture is focused on creating optimum conditions for the plants in order to get them to reach a mature size quicker. Get that tree up to size as fast as you possibly can, total weed control, total irrigation, all the fertilizer it wants, get them up to size as fast as you possibly can to kick it into adulthood sooner. Some other techniques that have been used horticulturally to induce earlier fruiting reproduction is to graft, to take stems. These are all grafted right here. You take a mature stem off of one tree and you graft it onto the seedling of a related tree. So here's a root stock of a seedling apple. and then you go put a variety on top of it from a mature tree, this will it's already hormonally changed over, and it's more mature than just a little baby seedling coming out of the seed. That's another way to overcome the juvenile phase. And then, of course, there is breeding, so that we breed for hyper-precocity. I'm getting ahead of myself on the pictures, but that's another option, and that's more of what we want to take, so that we don't have to get trapped with excessive amounts of work and or excessive amounts of inputs. It's the next slide right there. Through mass selection breeding, we can quickly discover hyper-precocious genotypes. There's two family lines. I've traced them all the way back to where I originally got them from. One is originally from a line of chestnut trees. These are chestnuts I'm talking about, from George Slate, who was a breeder back in the 20s through 50s at Geneva, New York. One family line came from him, and the other one, I'm going to have to look up where that came from. It might actually be from the same work. I'm not sure. But I have two family lines of chestnuts that you plant the seed, and out of 100 seeds, probably one or two of them, they'll sprout and immediately go to flower. Now, that's not beneficial for that plant if it was out competing in the wild, because it's putting all of its resources, tiny little tree, maybe 2 leaves, trying to make a nut. It'll almost kill itself. So that's not really a successful trait as a crop tree, but as a surrogate parent, now I know that this guy's going to reproduce really fast. I'll go find some other trees that have very specific characteristics, and I want to reproduce those fast. I can get that pollen on this flower here and start breeding in traits quicker that way, so it just becomes a surrogate parent for other ones that I'm testing to become crop trees. And we've all noticed this, that there are some trees, some that grew fast and got to adult size real fast. They're situated in the overstory, they're dominants, they got great soil, great water, and so they just don't flower, or they rarely do. Yet others might be highly fruitful. Where is this cough coming from? That's part of that whole genetic roulette. We have no idea what these genetics are going to be like, and if these plants are actually going to be very productive for us. If we're going to be depending on woody plants for our crop trees to produce seeds for us to eat, or for animals to eat, we want them to bear seed young, a lot of it, and regularly, with minimal inputs, sheer total utter neglect in the long run. There's some that actually do produce, and you guys have all seen trees. Tree of Heaven, the ailanthus. Oh my goodness, some of those just produced tons and tons and tons of seeds. We're just down in New Orleans area, Louisiana, last fall, and there was tallow trees, Chinese tallow trees, just with these little waxy fruit all over them. Amazing reproductive power in some of these trees. So once again, through mass selection breeding, we can discover the individuals that bear seed regularly, that ripen seed early in the season, late in the season. We can have a sequence of different trees, so we can harvest early, harvest middle, harvest late. And if we're just taking chestnut, which is the overstory here, and some of the understory, if we have somebody down in New Mexico growing chestnut, over time, and it won't take long if you have really hyper precocious plants, it won't take long, 3 or 4 generations before all of a sudden it may have started with the same genetic material that went down into Mexico, and then we send some up to Lynn, up in Manitoba, and some over to the fella up in Maine. Just after 3 generations, they're going to be drastically genetically different plants, because they've done the breeding work on their site to continue to improve their site adaptiveness. And so eventually we'll have trees that will like it hotter, colder, more acid, more alkaline, etc. There's several different genera of trees, such as maples, persimmons, ash popples, mulberries, sassafras. These are mulberries right here that have unisexual flowers. So either male flowers that produce pollen, or female flowers that have the ovary that will be pollinated and become the seed or the fruit. This is the male mulberry right here. All it does is cast pollen, and this is the female. What's fascinating about that, having different flowers on different plants, it guarantees it has to be outcrossed. You're not going to inbreed over time. When you have, I think the next slide talks about that, excessive inbreeding within a population, you will lose traits over time and gradually become more and more site adapted until you become endemic. And this helps to prevent that in a wild species. We had the discussion last week how a little bit of that is okay, but if we get excessive with that, that's not okay. These are some bottle trees from Madagascar on the right. Very, very endemic to only a few hundred square kilometers on the island of Madagascar, which is very, particular. It's isolated. That is, if that climate changes way too much, too fast, they're doomed. They don't have the flexibility within their gene pool that we know of to survive any other conditions than that. Took a picture of this because last summer when I went up to Isle Royal, I somehow lucked into going on a tour with some naturalists. Maybe I had the gift of gab or something like that. My father's initials are, after all, BS. And we went on a walk around this one particular bog that has these endemic sundews. And there's only several hundred of these little things right here. And they're very site-specific to this hyperacidic sphagnum bog. And you had to go through this boardwalk to go through it. So too much inbreeding can lead to the loss of genetic traits and in long term into hyperendemism. What is interesting, some trees, especially those fire adapted trees, I know red pine is one of them. Self-pollination is fairly common, and it's more as like an emergency survival technique. If there's a big huge fire wipes out an area and one little red pine managed to survive, it can pollinate itself. And then once it's pollinated itself, then its kids now start the crossing over process all over again. And it is a survival technique. And in many species, it leads to the dwarfing of the offspring, and they don't grow as well. But that's not the case, like in the red pine, for example. The red pine seems to not really have a lot of the negatives of self-pollinating. Now, there are species that have both male and female flowers on the same plant. Those are monoecious. This whole monoecious and dioecious thing drove me nuts. It's like dioecious, that means you have two on one, right? Well, no, dioecious means you have it on two separate plants. Monoecious, in my thinking originally, is like, well, that means, there's only one flower per plant. It's like, well, no, monoecious means they're all within one flower. So if you have both male and female flowers on the same plant, they're monoecious. When the male parts and the female parts, you got to think about form and function in nature. Male parts tend to be elongated and they spray all these tiny little cells all over the place, whereas female parts tend to have like petal type shapes, have moist receptors for pollen, etc. So if you got both in the same flower, that's called a perfect flower. Whereas an imperfect flower, the male parts and the female parts are separate. This is a hazelnut, American hazelnut here. These little flowers are just the size of just a tiny little paintbrush hair at the end of the bud. Small little bud. This is actually probably twice, if not three times the normal size. Tiny little things. But if you get backlit hazelnut flowers when they're in bloom, and it's truly a spectacular sight to see, like these shrubs all covered with spider webs, these little tiny fireworks of pinkish red. And this is the male catkin. And when it's ready to cast pollen all over the place, it elongates. It'll easily get 3 times as long as it ordinarily is. This is in the process of elongating, and then the anthers with the pollen grains on it will start sticking out as it gets longer. Now, this is what I think is fascinating, because this pretty much sums up the whole horticultural approach to increasing seed production. The most effective way to reduce the length of your juvenile phase is to grow seedlings in such a way that they get a large site as rapidly as possible. This right here is the summary of how you should do fruit and nut orcharding. If you're going to grow woody crops, or even for timber, this is the way they're telling you how to do it, because this is true. This is actually true. You grow them as fast as you can to get them to a large size, and then it'll shorten the length of juvenile phase. They'll go into maturity soon and start reproducing. Then you can mess with the light conditions. You can use reflective mulch underneath. You can use artificial light. You can apply fertilizers or other cultural methods. You can use hormones, gibberellic acid, and cultural treatments, removing of weed competition. All this kind of stuff will allow for early flowering in most woody species. Do you see what this sets up for us? By observing what actually works and then not thinking, uh-oh, the organizer has stopped sharing my webcam. It's no longer visible to other attendees. Can anybody even hear me?
Yeah, we can, Mark. There was a message saying that the webcam, and you were getting really pixelated, so that's why I just turned it off for a while. We'll see if we'll put it back on.
So this is a case where observing what actually happens can be accurate, but it really leads us down a path of excessive amounts of work. It's led us to where our woody crops industry is today, because we try to grow them as fast as possible. We adjust the light, we adjust the water, we apply fertilizers, we use cultivation techniques, we use hormones, we use all kinds of sprays. We try to stimulate early flowering with hormones and so on. That's all input, 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 input. Currently, right now, with the state of the economics of many different edible woody crop species, is no one's really making a whole bunch of money at it. We talked about chestnuts just a few weeks ago. You know that and I'm going to have to do this before we put these videos out as for sale items. I'm going to go through the Michigan State University paper and just look at how much you've got invested into these chestnuts before you ever get a return out of that system. And it's economically insane. Now, once they're at the adult phase, once they hit adult phase, now you can increase flower and seed production again by adding hormones and so on and so on. So this is all true. These are all ways to increase seed production. And if you want to go down that path, that's what modern agriculture has done. And that's not where I'm going. I'm going to a place of imitating the natural system, imitating its disturbance regime. And now let's use some selective breeding to find the specimens that that bypass this phase, and let's see if we can get our inputs accomplished by other parts of the system, like weed control by using animals, fungus control, disease control by using animals. How about pest control by using poultry? Fertilizer, obviously, taken care of by our animals. Let's try to get a rich, healthy ecosystem going where our inputs are taken care of by other yielding parts of the system. But that's all true, and this is where our tree crops industry is. Of course, reproductive cycle of the species, it's adapted to their environmental factors where they're at. And if you know, those of you in parts of the world with willow and cottonwood, you know about all the seeds they put out there. They flower real early in the spring. Very soon after breaking dormancy, they put seed, only 4 to 6 weeks later, and they make tons of it because it's wind disseminated and it's got to go into some kind of wet area, and usually it wants exposed soil as well. This is all cottonwood. Many other trees, for example, the seeds will develop later on throughout the growing season. Some, as early June and July, all the way up till October, November. The seeds of those tend to be larger, and it has different dormancies. It can lie dormant for longer periods of time. Please forgive the fact that I've got 3 different melons in this, and I just grabbed a picture off the internet. Everything else comes off of a tree, shrub, bush, or a vine. I suppose these are vines, and in the tropics, the cucurbits can be perennial too. So perennial vine, how do you like that? Now, the fruit, sugars, and large seeds are also important for animal dispersal of seed. There are some seeds that, for some reason, are adapted to go through the gut of an animal. These are honey locusts, acacias in Africa, baobab, of course, and I'm going to depend on somebody here in the group. I had a link to this earlier. I thought it was in one of my earlier webinars, and I can't find it now. There's a book about the species of North America, a lot of tree species in North America that are on decline. They're about, almost extinct when it comes to the population scale. There are still individuals surviving, but they're the ones that they're the ones that are dependent on going through the gut of an animal. If you can imagine, like this honey locust, what do you think ate honey locusts at Kentucky coffee trees in North America? Well, it was giraffes. There were two different species of giraffes native to North America. Also ground sloths. Probably the elephants did too. If you imagine having this big long pod, all the seed is surrounded by sugar. That sugar is totally not needed by the seed. The sugar is just an adaptation that makes it very attractive to large animals that chew on it. Now, elephant may only have 4 or 6 molars total in its whole entire head, but they're like, huge, gigantic hammerstones coming down. They'll bust apart any seed in the world, but 1 or 2 seeds goes through. Anybody from the Midwest who's eaten sweet corn in July knows that the very next day you've got some whole kernels of sweet corn going out the other side, and you thought you chewed them all, but nope, some goes right through. So when you've got these little seeds, they require having an acid bath to dissolve the super, super hard shell, and then they come out, land in a pile of fertilizer, and they have the perfect growing meaning from when they grow. So if one of you guys can find that link about the North American trees that need to go through animal guts, I'd really appreciate that. And we can repost that for others to check out. It's a fascinating read. Now, seedlings of upland growing species that grow up in the hills, sandy soils, gravelly soils, or super dry climates, they really need to develop a deep root system and fast. I tried to find a photograph of a hickory seedling. Our hickory seedlings, when we sell them, the top is maybe 4 to 6 inches tall, and the taproot is about 18 inches tall, easily 3 to 5 times longer. And so this is just an example here of the small seedling on top, this deep, long taproot. Here's a great guy. I just pulled this one off the internet. I have no connection with Native Tree Farm, but here's a classic example. Little tiny tree, gigantic root. There's more mass in that root than there is in this stem altogether. So this is most likely a dry site adapted species. One of the fascinating things, I've talked about it before, Wes Jackson from the Land Institute has shown pictures. He rolls out pictures of all these different crops, grain crops, and the length of the root system, 3, 5, 6, 12 feet long. Yay, everybody's happy. Then he goes up on the balcony and he rolls down this 30-foot long thing of big blue stem, 30-foot long roots. And everybody goes like, ooh, wow, that's incredible. It's like, sorry, step aside, little grass. Trees have deep root systems. And mesquite sets the record. I believe the last I looked, it was 412 some odd feet deep, roots from a like 10-foot tall mesquite, a small shrubby tree. Seedlings of dry climates, they need to develop a deep root system quickly. If you're in a dry climate area, it's actually culturally kind of stupid to water your plants too much in the early year or two, and it's especially stupid to try to water over the top like with a hose coming out of a tank. You want to, if you're going to water that, you water it deep, 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 so that water soaks in deep and encourages the roots to go down deep, and then let it dry off, because the surface will dry off first because it's exposed to the sun. As the surface dries off, the tips of the roots are down in the moist soil. As the moisture recedes lower and lower, that root's got to chase it down. You don't want to water them too much in dry climates in the early years. You've got to encourage that deep taproot growth. Now, back to our meristem. In all species, the reproductive buds, or the primordia of those buds, they're initiated the growing season before they ever open up. Now, if this was our cutaway of our cabbage here, right? For example, this is half cabbage, that's a quarter of a cabbage right here. These are each of the cabbage leaves that fold up over it. Well, in between, there's these little lumps right here. And these little lateral meristems, these primordia, it's a little clump of cells that are just starting to differentiate, and that some kind of person who spends too much time in the lab looking at buds would be able to say, oh yeah, that one's going to turn into a lateral branch. That's going to turn to a lateral branch. Here's some other pictures of these little buds in various different stages, and you can see how they've started to differentiate and turn into these little spooky Halloween faces and all that kind of stuff. So you'll be able to see that there was once upon a time a primordia here that now turned into a bud scale. This primordia will turn into a branch, bud scale, and so on. Back to our cabbage here. So this is a bud scale. Cabbage is a gigantic bud. And then in here, there are primordia that next year, see, because the cabbage is a biennial plant. So 1 year, it makes a round little cabbage head. The second year, it sends up a shoot, and it sends out laterals off to either side with flowers all over the place. So there are reproductive primordia in between these little scales right along here that won't show, they won't display until next year. So to get our system, to ensure that our system is a regenerative system, it has to be able to reproduce and regenerate itself. We have to have the conditions so that the individuals within it will go through their full, complete life cycle, and it can take time. Life cycle here in Douglas fir, for example, is 17 months. It starts with that bud starting to elongate, and lateral buds will start to grow. The lateral buds, you can see these little bumps. These are part of the what are going to turn into laterals. Then the vegetative bud bursts open. It starts to elongate, and then it starts to form new bud scales in here. And these lateral buds will become determined. So in Christmas trees in Wisconsin, you want to shear them before they set buds, because if you go ahead and I shear them after they've set buds, they've already set buds for next year's growth. You won't make that Christmas tree any thicker. But if you shear them before they've set their lateral buds, they'll set twice as many because of the stress of it. So what happens with hazelnuts, for example, is they'll go through the leaf buds open up. They flower early. You saw the male and female flowers, and the leaf buds open up. There'll be some stem elongation. Once it reaches a maximum of stem elongation, then the stem will fatten up a little bit. Then it'll set its leaf buds for next year, and then it'll start to set its flower buds for the following year after that. I think it's related to the heat in this place. We got the heat turned up too much. Then the following spring, see right here goes through March and April. These buds that were set last summer now open up. You have the pollen-bearing ones and the ovary-bearing flowers, the males and the females. You have fertilization that goes on. The embryo and the seed developed, and then you've got this cone in this Doug fir, for example, that's not ready until September. Then it sheds its seed. The seed has to find some place where it can go and have the proper conditions to lay dormant throughout the whole entire winter, and then sprout at the appropriate time in the spring. Our systems are not regenerative unless they take into account the reproductive life cycles of the plants in our system and allow those plants and those plant communities to reproduce and persist over time. Just wanted to show you some differences. You can tell the difference in buds many times. These are blueberry, some high bush blueberry trees that I've got growing beneath spruce trees. And if you see these smaller buds along the stem, these are the leaf buds. These will be leaves and then turn into lateral shoots next year. Some of these, you can see how this was elongated and it sent out lateral shoots. Lateral shoots. On the lateral shoot, you got these small buds. These are leaf buds, and they'll make more laterals. And then out at the end, we got these big fatties. These are the flower buds. These will make all the cute little bells. What we also have on this that I wanted you guys to see is we have some browsing damage. We can see we've got plenty of buds here, so we're going to get leaves and we're going to get lateral shoot development, but there will be no fruit coming off the tip of that branch right there. This browse damage is from deer. You can see right here, this is a classic way of tearing it. Deer only have incisors on the bottom, and then they got molars on the back. They got some up top, but they don't bite with them. They pull with their bottom teeth. They grab it, and then they tear. So with deer, you'll have the branches torn. Same with moose, but they're taller. Moose will sometimes grab a whole stem and snap it and then tear it all off. Elephants just like to knock the whole doggone tree over. You can also tell by the height off the ground that this was deer. Whereas if you have rabbit damage, it's down low. These are also blueberries. These are the same pictures. Rabbits will do like a 60-degree angle cut. It's fairly clean. It's just like somebody took pruners to it, made a nice little pungy stick for you to step on. And you can still see we've got these little lateral buds on the side here. There'll be leaves and stems. Now, some of the bud primordia, those little packets of cells, they'll form bud scales, and then they just stop. They just sit there. And they're called latent buds. Typically, where they hide out is right in here at an axil, A-X-I-L, which is where the tubes of vessels inside the tree come here and start to go out along this bunch of needles. And then these other ones go past it. So that junction between the ones that go out and the ones that go past it, that's an axil right in there. And that's typically where your latent buds will be. The latent buds are really important if you've got the terminal buds removed by herbivory. And even if the lateral buds are removed, like in this case right here, there are no buds on this pine. This is a Korean pine. The deer just browsed it right off. Not to worry. This has all these latent buds hidden underneath. It will sprout out new vegetative buds, possibly pollen cone buds and seed cone buds, etc. later on. So some herbivory damage it's not the end of the world. You still got buds in there. With blueberries, for example, you will not get fruit next year. With pines, sometimes you can. There's another picture of the pine been browsed sufficiently by my ungulate friends. The latent buds were also really important. Like this last spring in Wisconsin, we had a normal frost in May, like the 18th or 20th of May, somewhere around there. What was not normal was that it was abnormally warm before that, and a lot of trees were starting to emerge. And then what was also not normal is when we got that typical spring frost, as the temperature went way cold and it held for a whole entire day. We had a 16-degree Fahrenheit freeze overnight and all day the next day through the second night, and it just smoked. All this foliage, it's not really all that focused, just withered. Things like chestnut, they tend to have all of their, as the stem elongates, the flower buds are in there with the elongating stem, and so sometimes they got burned off. If the tree had enough resources stored in its roots and had enough latent buds, some of them went ahead and they flushed a second batch of flowers. But the majority of my chestnuts this year, I'd say probably 80–90%, did not have a crop because their flower buds were frozen off in the springtime. But the latent buds were there, so the tree doesn't care. The tree doesn't really care if it gives crops every year. It's only me who cares about that. All it needs to do is survive the conditions and reproduce every once in a while. Of course, the timing of pollen release is all site related. If it's wind pollinated, they typically tend to flower early in the spring before the leaves come out. We've got red maple over here, obviously willow down here. This is a elm over here. Now, bees will visit these, and other pollinating insects will visit these, but that's not necessarily how the pollen really gets along. The bees are mostly after nectar, and pollination is somewhat accidental. Like if you look at chestnuts and hazelnuts, for example, the chestnuts and hazelnuts are imperfect flowers. The bees will be up here getting pollen and nectar. They're nowhere near the female flower, so they never bring pollen to it. It's all wind pollinated. The same is the case with these. These are predominantly wind pollinated, even though pollinating insects go there because pollen is fun stuff. Of course, early flowering before leaf out in wind pollinated species isn't the it's not all of them. Just as a general rule, they're the ones that wind pollinated species bloom before the foliage is really set. Chestnut blooms middle of the summertime. Summer solstice through 4th of July is when the chestnuts are blooming in our place. And these are chestnuts. It looks like rose is an understory, or no, those are service berries, Juneberries, Saskatoons, whatever you guys want to call them. Wind pollinated plants, of course, tend to put out enormous amounts of pollen. Those are you who are in spruce or pine country around lakes and rivers. You see that all the time, the yellow pollen all over the place. They put out much more pollen than insect pollinated species like apples and cherries and pears and so on. And now the plants also, so not only do we have to accommodate their flowering cycle, their pollination cycle, we also have to accommodate their reproduction cycle. And sometimes they put on heavy crops, sometimes light crops. Abundant flower and seed production occur irregularly in a lot of trees. Mast are nut and fruit trees, in which that pattern is especially pronounced. Oak is the classic. There'll be some years where there's just acorns, inches deep across the ground, and you'll just roll all over the place on these little ball bearings. And then you go 5, 6, 7, 10 years without any acorns at all. It's a very effective strategy for them to survive seed predation because the squirrels and mice just can't eat them fast enough. So they bury them all over the place. They have plenty in their stores, and then they last throughout the whole dormant season, and then they sprout. So you have acorns sprouting in the springtime all over the place, and then no more acorns for years, so you never build up a big predator population to be able to consume all the nuts. Fast-growing species in general, like birch, for example, this is birch seeds just swept off of a driveway. They produce tons and tons and tons of seed. They're wind-disseminated seed. They have a hard time finding a bare piece of ground. Like, good luck, if you're a seed on a birch tree, finding a piece of bare ground. Probably the minority of birch seeds actually hit the ground and germinate. Then some species, this one really tripped me out. I did the research on this in these past few days. I'd heard about this, but I didn't, read as much as I had recently. And somebody pronounced the Latin for me, Philistasis, bambusoides. There's particular types of bamboo in India, in China area, that all of the seed of all of the bamboo of this particular type sprouts at the same time. And the individual plant will grow multi-stems, so they grow as clones. And the clones grow together, they bump into one another, and they weave through each other. So this may be one clone, it may be 3 or 4 clones. I don't know exactly how many it is. And they keep growing until they totally radically change the site conditions where they're at. They deplete all the nutrients, maybe they use too much water. And then when they hit stress, they've totally overtaxed the system. Every single one of them flowers at the same time, and then they all drop dead. And that sometimes is 120 to 150 year life cycle that all of a sudden every single one of them flowers, seeds, and dies. Pretty amazing. So if you're going to grow that kind of bamboo, you just got to know that that's going to come, that day is going to come someday. So generally speaking, the more favorable the site conditions, climate, soil, water, the greater the seed crop. Once again, this is where horticulturists have jumped on this. This is a certified organic cherry orchard, and they're doing fairly immaculate weed control underneath with probably a weed badger tool that goes by and tills it all up, and then applying compost and mulch and whatever sprays and bells and whistles that they're using, because it actually does stimulate a greater seed crop. When the plants have favorable conditions, they'll produce more seeds. There is a genetic component to this. So let's select 4 hyper-precocious, which means they reproduce early, then heavy-yielding plants. If regular plants will produce more seeds when they're mature and more seeds when the site conditions are favorable, well, what do you think will happen if we take a tree that becomes mature young and produces heavy crops? Don't you think it will produce even more seed if we take care of it? So let's do the breeding, get the seeds in the ground first, then let's worry about taking care of the site and the conditions over time, slowly, manageably, so we don't break our bank, instead of spending 2 or 3 years on site preparation, getting the soil ready. This is where I totally disagree with the people who say, like, dig a $40 hole for a $10 tree. Let's get the tree in the ground. Let's worry about the site conditions later. Sometimes when plants produce a super huge crop, it can reduce the cold hardiness. It can lead to stem dieback because that tree, remember we talked about there's only so much photosynthate that it has. It has some for growth, some for reproduction, and some for storage to sprout again, leaf out again next year. And it does have a certain degree of partitioning, which is somewhat genetically controlled, of how much resources it will put to what particular phase. This tree evidently put so much into producing a crop that during a drought season, it was not irrigated, it died back quite ferociously. And actually here, this is a picture of some of my hazels. These are the controlled cross hazels that we have at Forest Ag this year. They produce tons and tons of nuts. They'll bend. The reason why I'm holding the branch up with my arm is because they almost bend down to the ground. Stems will tend to die back, which you think, oh, that's a horrible loss. These stems are dying back, but it's actually doing the pruning for me. So it takes 2 years to get a branch that looks like that. 1 year it elongates, and then the second year it puts out laterals with nuts on it. And then if it has too many nuts like this, it may totally burn out that stem. It'll use all the resources, stored energy in that stem. Then that stem dies. Now there's more sun getting into the plant, so your next sprouts can come up through that. So it's pretty slick. Bang, somebody got it, The Ghost of Evolution. Thank you very much. That's the book about the trees with the requirement of going through an animal gut. So now, recall, of course, that seeds are dispersed by gravity, wind, water, animals, and any other combination thereof. You were trying to groan about something, Wayne?
Yeah, well, Sam also put, I think it was Sam or Daniel put a PDF even in there for everybody to look at. So, I mean, a reference to one. Pretty cool.
So obviously we've got water moving seeds downstream. This is actually for those who are in an area where there's lots of Japanese knotweed. Most of the propagules, and it's just chunks of roots and stem of Japanese knotweed, falls into a stream and it washes down wherever it lodges. It tends to grow again. That's how a lot of willows propagate. These guys are fluttering in the wind. Animals carry different waves from burrs to making seed caches. Most seed is dispersed quite locally, and then that's why they're so slow to migrate over time. I think it's like the first or second or third webinar that I did showed like the historic records of where these different tree species showed up in their migrations through long periods of time. Chestnut tree, for example, you look at this seed right here, I'm willing to bet you a nickel that within the next day or two, that seed's going to go thump, and that's it. It just falls right to the ground. Maybe it gets picked up by a squirrel and moved a little bit. Maybe it rolls downhill and gets caught in a swale. I have lots of chestnuts that sprout in swales. Most of the chestnuts that I have regenerating on New Forest Farm in Wisconsin are from squirrel or mouse caches. They make a little store of nests, and so I'll get like 15, 20, 30 little chestnuts sprouting in the thicket. And in the middles between rows of chestnuts in this one place that I was just thinking of telling that story, the critters will dig the tunnels in with the elderberries. And so you get like 4, 5, 6 chestnut trees growing right up into the elderberries. And wow, check it out. How on earth did I get winecap stropharia growing right underneath my chestnut trees? And so once you've got them established, whenever you go pick them for dinner, you can go cut this off and you can crumble this up, chop it up in a zillion little pieces and stuff it under the grass or the leaves somewhere else, and you just keep spreading them and spreading them and spreading them. They're really cool mushrooms. I really like how they behave, and they so happy to just naturalize. They'll naturalize in your lawn if you've got a really soddy lawn with lots of thatch. Seed dormancy varies greatly. Now, it also depends a lot on the climate. If you think about it, willows and cottonwoods, they're more wetland type species or flood zone, riparian zone species. They don't last very long. They don't really store that long at all. Whereas some seeds like chestnut, some oaks, white oak, for example, as soon as that nut hits the ground, it starts putting the root out. And chestnuts, we select against those. I don't put those guys in our seed for planting into trees because I don't want them to sprout in the refrigerator, not until April or May. You don't want to have them sprout in the grocery store. People might not like that, but they do. They'll sprout really early. They're very perishable. Whereas things like the honey locust, my goodness, these things can stay dormant. I don't know how long. I had a nursery bed at my dad's place back when I first read Tree Crop by J. Russell Smith in the late 1970s, maybe 1980s. I planted a whole bed of honey locust seeds and just walked away. I didn't do any kind of scarification, stratification, acid bath, hot water, nothing. I just planted them in the ground. The next year, a whole bunch sprouted, and I transplanted them somewhere else. The next year after that, they sprouted. The next year after that, they sprouted. There was 7 years in a row I kept pulling honey locust seedlings out of there. And then my brother moved back in to my folks' place and expanded the lawn and has mowed it ever since. So who knows how many years those seeds would have just laid dormant. Keep sprouting, keep sprouting, keep sprouting. What an incredible survival technique. If you think about like the honey locusts and the acacias surviving in very, very drought-prone areas, they might just have to sit around long enough until the conditions are right and then they sprout. An establishment is the most critical stage in the plant's life, and there are all kinds of adaptations that our plants have in order to have seedlings that will survive and reproduce. And you think about that. This is one of the defining characteristics of restoration agriculture, is we're using plants that are adapted to our conditions, are very closely adapted to our conditions, and we're not going to really baby these things. The ones that survive in our situation, they're adapted to it, and nature has all these tricks up its sleeve. They have a certain specific set of requirements that will help them to flourish, and our job is just to kind of like manage the system and allow it to do its thing and to interact with it in such a way that we're imitating its regenerative ecology. You think about a sugar maple. If you scatter all kinds of sugar maple seeds out in the middle of a pasture in the full sun, they probably won't be very happy. They would like a nice, shady, partially shade, very moist, humid environment. It oodles these little sugar maple seedlings all over the place. Of course, they're not all going to grow there. Maybe 1 or 2 trees will eventually come to colonize that site. But they have to have a certain set of conditions to receive their seedlings in order for them to regenerate. So when we're designing systems, mimicking natural ecosystems, we know that our disturbance regime and our site conditions will allow for our system to propagate itself. You know you're doing a good job when your neighbors start having your plant community systems growing on their farms. Don't tell my neighbors. Shh. So if you're on a site that's very shallow, rocky soil with lots of wind, obviously you're going to have some kind of thing that imitates this wind effect, or have the natural wind of the place kick in on its own. And you think about, there is a lot of fascination to put up windbreaks because we have to protect our trees and crops from the wind. It's like, well, no, our trees and crops need the wind in order to propagate. We need to have some exposed mineral soil. We need to have a collection of mulch in the bottom that naturally will start to collect. We have to concentrate a little bit of water in there, mix the organic matter with the mineral soil. Now I have a little seed bed. Some of these little seeds can grow. We need some rotten wood in here for other species so they can get in there and run their roots through this beautiful decaying wood. All of these things work together. This is not like a simple plus and minus. A huge amount of different things work together to allow these things to propagate and regenerate year after year after year after year. We recognize this as some sort of order. We can look and say, oh yeah, that's a northern white pine, jack pine system around the Great Lakes, or wherever you are, you can recognize it. Okay, so some specific phases here. This is kind of important because we can choose to stay in any one of these if we want to. We have pioneer species. They seed out in open areas following major disturbances like fire, flood, windstorm, landslide. There's hardly any competition at first. Growth is fast, really fast. These are all loblolly longleaf pines down in Virginia, growing out there with a Kentucky 32 endophyte infected fescue. Floodplain species, they tolerate all kinds of variable water levels. They're flooding and drying and flooding and drying, soil washing away, deposition. They can fall over and root again. That's another pathway. Now think about this. If you live anywhere that has flooding that occurs occasionally, wouldn't it make sense to have plants that are adapted to that. Why not select crops like down here? Let's pretend that these are willows or something. Wouldn't it make sense to have some biomass willows in here instead of these red cedars that belong in a high dry site? Pick the species that are adapted to your site and the disturbance conditions that will occur there. Fire-dependent pioneers, this is how they behave, is they are accustomed to catastrophic wildfires that burns everything. It's like a clear cut. It removes all of the tops, exposes the mineral soil, and they sprout huge thickets of single variety monocultures, naturally monocultures. This was a controlled ground fire down in North Carolina from a week or so ago. This is a photo from Yellowstone after the fires back in the late 80s. This is some of the natural ecology of these particular species. If you have fire-adapted species, it's totally okay to have a catastrophic disturbance such as a plow and plant monocrops of these trees at super high densities, and also know that you can add other things in there with it, and you will now have to begin removing these stems, these little green stems, to make sure that you keep the conditions that we are striving for. There's gap phase species. If you got a forest area, now you got wind. This is an example here of wind blowing these trees down. White pine is a classic, in the humid east of North America, that once they're exposed, they'll hang out in the understory for a little while, but once there's a hole or an opening or whatever, they can shoot like crazy and grow straight up, and then they'll hold that position, and the rest of the woods can keep blowing down around them forever and ever and ever. This is taken up in the Boundary Waters last summer, Minnesota. This is once again just showing the wind damage, and here's that gap specialist. And it made me look, there's no white pines around anywhere. I don't see any white pines in the system except for this one trunk right here. Well, now there's a blowdown. It's going to be casting seed all through here on the bare mineral soil of those root plates that were tipped up, and now it's going to propagate that way. Some more wind throw. Now there's the extremely shade-tolerant species. They're able to establish in the understory, and they stay there, and they can almost hang out in the cellar. It's so dark. And grow this one cell at a time, one cell at a time. Beech are notorious for this. Hemlock and fir, western red cedar are like this. Do you guys see what I see? We've seen this picture over and over again. This is at the stem exclusion phase. Trees are dying like crazy, not enough light, not enough water. And who's hanging out here just happy as can be? Got a little beech tree there, got a little beech tree there. They're going to just persist and just hang in there. They'll wait until these silly little loblolly pines die at age 200 or 300 years old. Now it'll be a nice beech forest there. All right. This is too much fantastic information. How can I handle all this? Well, call Karen at Forest Agriculture Enterprises. She can help you out with regionally specific seedling trees. Imitate your natural plant communities. You don't have to remember anything that I've talked about in these past 30 webinars. If you just imitate your natural plant communities, pick out the species that you want that will produce the food, fuels, building materials, medicines that you want or need in your area. Every place around the world where people live have natural plant communities, perennial plant communities that are adapted to where you live. And if you plant those, you'll have success. Why fight success? Duh. There's a client that I've been working with that here's these natural plant communities. You can do this. We've done enterprise budgets. This is what it looks like it's going to return. So, yeah, but I live in this like swampy drained swamp in north central Minnesota, and I want to grow peaches. It's like, excuse me, you live in a tile drained swampy area in north central Minnesota. Here's your plant community. Grow this and you'll succeed. Yeah, but I want to grow peaches. That's the height of human arrogance. Just because we can grow cactus up in the bananas up in the Colorado Rockies doesn't mean we should. Just because you can grow, pomegranates in Circle Hot Springs, Alaska, at what expense? Why not plant a successful system that actually works, it imitates nature, and it feeds you? Strategically disturb your site based on how your species move into an area and colonize an area. Establish your closely mimicked plant community according to what you want. This happens to be a medicine polyculture, all these different rows right here, various different medicinal plants for making essential oils and salves and teas and tinctures and all that kind of stuff. Episodically disturb the site, mimicking herbivory. How do we mimic herbivory? How about with herbivory? With cows, pigs, chickens, sheep, turkeys, etc. We can mimic the wind by knocking trees over every once in a while. Mimic an elephant with your tractor and a front end loader. Just push the doggone thing over. We can mimic it with fire by using fire, or we can mow. Do the appropriate disturbance appropriate to your particular species. And when we disturb, we want to harvest a yield. When I go into a site, I want to be harvesting, at worst case scenario, I want to be harvesting firewood, mushroom logs. I want to be planting mushroom spawn. I want to be here harvesting raspberries, harvesting grapes, harvesting blackberries, harvesting mulberries. So now to maintain our system by harvesting, instead of input, 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 we want to maintain it by output, output, output. We disturb the site in order to keep it in the most productive successional phase in order to meet our objectives. For me, it's a savanna. I want the grass. I like to eat animal parts. Your food and livelihood, if you want to have a closed canopy forest and grow timber, and that's fine too. If you want to harvest pine nuts and timber or acorns and timber, you'll get better acorns if you're in the full sun. Your food and livelihood now comes from your interacting with a genuine natural community as a hopefully intelligent and informed disturbance. You are disturbing the site in a way that these plants are adapted to that helps to stimulate them to grow fast, produce lots of seed and fruit, and all kinds of other values, beauty, wildlife, habitat, and so on and so on. And you can now harvest multiple yields in successional time. People ask me, well, how's your system work? What's your biggest cash crop? It's like, well, last year it was this, the year before it was that. Through the years, we have never done anything the same because the system is always changing. It's always changing. The climate's always changing. The weather's always changing. This was a cornfield when we first got to this farm, this particular picture right here. I get a kick out of this. I really get a kick out of this knowing that absolutely everything in here is a food plant. Okay, so I don't eat grass. The cows do and the pigs do. This is a movie clip in the movie Inhabit that was shot at this exact site right here. So if we can live in a system like this, have all of our food needs met, all of our fuel needs met, building material needs met, we're taking carbon out of the atmosphere, purifying the water, so on and so on. And we're going to harvest the decay cycle as well as the growth cycle. We already saw the mushrooms earlier. Wouldn't you rather live right here? I would. Now, a quickie little discussion. I know we're running out of time. There is a definition that's being discussed within the community. I'm going to put the community in quotes. It's the definition is for regenerative agriculture. And I'm going to read the working draft that's going through this and look at this picture as we look at this picture. This picture right here, the redwood sugar pine system, this is ecologically, according to the definitions that have been around for 100 years plus, this is a regenerative system. It has been there for 2,000 to 5,000 years. It is adapted to its local climate, soil, etc. It will reproduce itself and keep going forever and ever and ever without any input whatsoever. It meets the definition of ecological regenerative system. This is regenerative agriculture because we can get our food out of here from our sugar pines, our blackberries, raspberries. But the working definition that the community is using says, regenerative agriculture is a system of farming principles and practices that increases biodiversity, enriches soils, improves watersheds, enhances ecosystem services. By capturing carbon in the soil and above ground biomass, regenerative agriculture aims to reverse global climate change. At the same time, it offers increased yields, resilient to climate instability, higher health and vitality for farming communities. The system draws from decades of scientific and applied research by the global communities, organic farming, agriculture, holistic grazing, agroforestry. And regenerative agriculture develops out of a living system, a connection between humans and their ecosystems through agriculture. And like living systems, regenerative agriculture will evolve and grow. Well, excuse me, if you want to look at this picture right here, this site is fully occupied. It is at about a carbon maximum. It's carbon saturated. It can store no more carbon in its soil because the soil is like 90% pure peat of 1,000, 5,000 years of needles that are not decomposed. It's got how many thousands of tons of carbon in the stems. You can't take any more carbon out of the atmosphere. So if we're going to do regenerative agriculture according to the community definition here, we have to actually capture more carbon in the soil and above ground biomass. Well, how do you do that? The best way to capture more carbon would be to remove this whole entire thing, plant a system of really fast growing trees. Now we can remove more carbon. This system here is actually probably putting more carbon into the air at this stage of the game than it's taking out, because these trees are decaying faster than they're growing. How about increasing biodiversity? Once you get to an old growth phase, remember we were talking about the savanna phase, it's like the species richness phase. It's all of the benefits of grassland and all the benefits of forest. Once you get into closed canopy forest, you start to have fewer species involved. This system right here has fewer species than if you cut it all down and started turning it into a savanna. Increasing yields. How do you increase yields in this system? You can't increase yields in this system. This system is at maximum. So this doesn't qualify according to the community definition of regenerative agriculture. Then it says we're supposed to have a resilience to climate instability. Well, this is it's not totally endemic, but it's a very site-adapted system. And if you knock this 5,000-year-old redwood tree down, or take all these redwood trees down, what it does is it sets the whole entire system back ecologically, and it goes into savanna, and then you do it again, and it goes back into grassland, and all you got to do is look at California north to south. That has been set back degeneratively into grassland. It's not stable. This system is not stable, but it's regenerative because it will regenerate itself over and over again. So part of what I wanted to do is stimulate a little conversation and start thinking about this use of the term regenerative when it comes to agriculture. And I stand on the side of ecological sciences, biological sciences, and that the definition of regenerative is that the individuals, the communities, and the ecosystem is able to perpetuate itself, propagate itself, and migrate and change and adapt through time. It's a self-perpetuating system. It's a permanent agriculture. Permaculture, wow. This is a place that I was at in France with Jeffrey and my wife Jen this spring. This guy got a piece of property. I don't know which guy in the picture it is, and I won't blame him. He's going to start a permaculture farm. Out of like 5 acres, approximately 3 of it is under plastics. Hoops with plastic over the top, or plastic mulch. He's growing all these different kinds of things. They're doing variety trials to see what will survive, because we want to do permaculture. And we got this big, horrible problem, how to get rid of all these goddamn blackberries, because there's blackberries everywhere. Excuse me? Permaculture? Show me something in here that's permanent. I don't see anything in here that's permanent. This is all junk that's going to fall apart, and the crops are not adapted to the site. It's not regenerative because it won't reproduce itself. As soon as the people who are managing this go away, this whole thing falls apart. This is not permanent agriculture. This is what he destroyed, and there's a whole bunch of videos that Jeffrey actually almost had to sit on me to keep me from flipping out about it. He cut all of this stuff down, and from violets to hazelnuts to there's currants. There's hawthorns, there were grapes, there's chestnuts. He had to cut it all down to do variety trials to see what works. Excuse me? This particular photo right here, we went through it, including the ferns for ornaments, and we figured out that in a 10 meter by 10 meter square, you can pull $400 worth of products out of that right away while improving its productivity to dandelions. I see down the bottom there. And then this was on the edges, elderberry, and I mean, artichokes naturally reproducing with mulberry overstory. Let's think about what we're doing here, people. And do we want to grow peaches on a swamp in north central Minnesota? Or do we want to imitate our natural ecosystems and go to something like this that's actually regenerative? This is actually regenerative. It can sustain itself a long time, will sustain itself a long time. This, of course, is a wild example. A restoration agriculture system in sugar pine country would look different than this does. But this, to me, is the ultimate regenerative agriculture system, and it fails all of the different criteria that the definition of regenerative agriculture lays out. And so I'm not saying what's right or what's wrong. I'm saying that what we need to do is be very clear about what we're thinking about, what we're talking about, what words we use, and all that kind of stuff. And I appreciate your patience, and I will now take some questions. So I did see a question here. Mulberry, can a female mulberry be grafted onto a male rootstock in order to achieve berry yield? Absolutely, yes. That's what I do. Is that once I find out that they are males for sure, I'll go ahead and I will I'll graft my favorite females on top of that. So let me see if I can find some other.
By the way, Mark, I'm back. I lost my audio for a second. My phone. There's a bunch of them here. You seeing the questions? My audio on my phone, which I've been using. I'm seeing them. You had a bunch of them here. So Ray made a comment. You'll love it. A lot of scientists like to hear themselves talk a lot. LOL. Look at what God made and work toward that. It's regenerative and sustainable. Let's see.
I just want to comment that for a second. Regardless of whether you ascribe a intelligent being to the origin of all of this, or it's just total randomness. In one sense, who gives a rip? This is what works. This is the way this planet is. And to fight against it is a height of folly, and it screws us up long term and short term. It makes all these different social problems. Absolutely, imitate what works. Here it is. It's the master pattern. Anyways, get me going.
So I don't know whether he said this sort of in jest or not, but maybe you know the story, Mark. But Sam says moose love to eat beet greens too. Ask me how. I know. I've had moose. We're asking Sam.
I've had moose pull the beets right up out of the ground and not even eat the darn beets. They like eat the greens, but they pull it up first because it's fun or something. Then they eat the greens and then take one bite out of the beet and go like, blah. At least that's what I had in my experience. So what we did, this is one of my first examples, because the guy I was working for, I said, well, let's plant a hawthorn hedge around the whole place and have a supersonic dense hawthorn hedge. He looked at me as if I was crazy. He said, that might work. And it did. The guy's name was Don Dinkle, funny name. He was the son of one of the original Matanuska homesteaders up in north of Anchorage. And for 4, 5, 6 years in a row, he had the World Record Giant Cabbage Award. And I was working with him, and that's when I learned how to really grow super big vegetables, and that was the year that I got the largest zucchini at the Alaska State Fair. So that was my beet story, Sam.
Well, we'll see if Sam, if you want to be unmuted, Ray, just put your hand. We'll unmute you, and you can tell your story, or else you can put it in chat. I don't know if you got this, Mark, because I was running around looking for another phone. On lettuce seeds needing light, you mentioned that. Are you saying that they only need a few minutes of direct sun and then they can be covered, or do they need moisture at the time of the sunlight?
No, the sunlight is something that's really quick, I guess. And I've heard that people, you just put it out in the sun for a little bit, and just when you're sprinkling it down into the row, just give it a little time, and that just boosts the germination. And do I have data and research to back up how long you should do that? Nah, I just plant all the rows first before I bury them and water them. So to contact Karen, it's forestag.com. Anyone who wanted to know.
Yeah, and I put that you could get to it over Restoration Ag also. There'll be a link there. Let's see, got several. Oh, so Sam did put in. He said they hate the tuber, love the greens. Fairbanks moose at least, he's saying. So Sam has a good question, and then John Paul does after that. So by definition, you're proposing the key difference in conventional and regenerative ag is abandoning the fixation on keeping the agroecosystem at a fixed moment in succession. He's asking
not necessarily. See, that's the thing, is that it is with regenerative, the definition of regeneration, ecological definition of regeneration, means that it can propagate itself. And if you look at the savanna, for example, the places that have been historically savanna for a long period of time, the disturbance factors are such that it maintains it in the semi-open grassland phase. So it's always in the savanna phase, but there's still recruitment of the next generation, and there's the older trees dying away, but staying in the savanna phase. So if we use our disturbance to keep it in one phase, it's not the end of the world as long as we're in sync with the natural disturbance regimes that would be happening in that place and to those species. That's what's different about the regenerative part, is that we have the full, complete life cycle of the ecosystem, and the whole entire ecosystem is able to reproduce itself and propagate itself through time. That's the big difference on the definition.
Great. John Paul's got a great question. I don't know that I've ever heard you with this one. So, what is one of your favorite sites other than New Forest Farm with respect to the system you helped to establish, and why?
Oh, doggone it. There's, once upon a time, there really weren't any others, which was kind of depressing. My property up in Maine is pretty nice. It's got a different character to it than New Forest Farm does. I really like Ben Fox Homestead. It's funny because it's only like a few acres, and he moans about how much work it takes, and I'm looking around there, it's like, dude, you could be done with all of the work on this place by noon and have the rest of the year off. I like how he integrates things really well together. It's all tied together pretty well. Probably my most scenic preference is a site in central Kentucky, kind of a shy and retiring guy. You've seen a lot of the silvopasture videos from his place. I really like that site. Sheesh. You put me on the spot there, Jean-Paul.
And then he has a second part. Well, he has a second part. This one will be easy, probably. What about one of the favorite sites you visited, so you didn't really do anything with it, that you didn't help to establish? So just something you visited.
Like Ben Fox, I didn't establish that. There's been several systems in France. Probably the one that I liked the most was the mountainsides in Italy there. Those are just amazing, and the fact that there were Europeans, man. There were Europeans that lived that way for thousands of years, way up in the hills, the way I lived up in Alaska, like straight up and down. And when I was dreaming about, 20 years ago in Alaska, it's, oh, wouldn't it be great to have like these cultures that live up in the hills and, these nice little paths and everything is edible and all that kind of stuff. I didn't realize that that's part of my own culture. It's like the European mountain people, we lived that way. Actually, some of the oldest preserved foods on the planet are dried chestnuts. So that was beautiful to me because of the architecture included, is that you built with what you had, and that was like rocks. And you just piled them up, but if you pile them up just right, instead of living in a rock pile, you live in a really nice house. And to have a culture that's based around enjoying food and drinking wine with your friends and eating really, really good, having really good ingredients, having a nap in the middle of the day, that's really cool. I really like that.
Yeah, I figured you might say that site because...
How did I determine the economic value of 10 meters square in France was because I've been in the produce business and in the ornamental business for a number of years, and I did it based on numbers of bunches of things that you would sell, and then numbers of chunks of wood that would be inoculated with mushroom spawn that would turn into a whatever amount of mushrooms to sell at X dollars a pound. That's how I calculated that. It was obviously a rough estimate, but that's a big thing. There was another site actually in. I've got pictures of it. I took, and I wanted to include it on this. There's a sustainable agriculture project in Durham, North Carolina, where they got all kinds of grant money. They're going to do sustainable agriculture. They go out to this site that has pecan and persimmons and hazelnut in the underbrush and blueberries. And what else was in there? It's spacing out on a lot of it. There's like a whole suite of edibles in there already. So they got money to bulldoze everything, and they took like 5 acres, and they pushed all the trees down. It was like 10 years after clear cut, put them up in a big, huge pile. So there's this big, huge pile of brush. It's all in pure sand, outwash plain sand, and they're trying to grow clover in it, and they're wondering why they're having problems growing anything. So show me the sustainability in that, folks. Show me the sustainability there.
Yeah, that was good. You know, Paul, he said this to me. I don't think he has 100% slopes. 100% means that they're vertical, Paul, but they're probably pretty steep.
No,
That's a pretty decent
no,
question,
no,
right
no,
above the one you just did there.
100%, Wayne, is 45 degrees. That's 100%. That's a one rise over one run. That's 100%.
All right. All right. That's a different way. All right. Well, that's not the way climbers do it, by the way. So that's my climber, the way that climbers were talking about. So. All right. Well, anyway, go with his question above there. Right above the one you just did.
Which
I have 100% grade. You did Daniels. That's Paul Miller's. I have 100% grade pine, fir, cedar, Oregon maple that has basal area over 200. Plan to cable thin. Have had some wind throw. Should I make an alley in wind? And then he says direction.
Personally, I would want to do a strip cut. You know, you can still do all with a cable. Do a strip cut and have these strips laid out so that I'm having the residual stand be as close to contour as possible. And if it's feasible, you've got the labor to do it, have the brush all laid out horizontal as well. Because that way, if you're going around the slope, if you've got wind issues, don't make any of the alleys any more than 2 times the height of your highest material coming out, because they have to help hold each other up. And if you have your alleys less than 2 times the height, they'll stay somewhat shaded. The alleys will stay somewhat shaded, and you'll at least get your trees to regenerate. I don't know if that's what you want to do. You might want to strip it all out and have grass growing in there. I don't know if that's your call, but that's what I'd do. Is I'd strip cut horizontally on contour.
And he actually commented about 3 down from that. He must have been thinking, and he's talked about contouring, stripping on contour. And he's got, it's only about an acre of his.
Oh, if it's an acre, that's not a problem. And if Andrew wants to know where my site is,
he gave us some history on that. Yeah, he was asking that.
Yeah, if Wayne, I mean, if this guy wants to know where my site is, we're out of phase.
I'll go ahead. Yeah.
Well, if that guy wants to know where my place is in Maine, he's got to make it past all the armed guards and tank traps. You know, it's my my bug out location, so it's undisclosed location. It's up in the Down East Lakes region.
That probably was enough for him.
Yeah.
Paul had told us before, Mark, that the history of his place was it's in the gold area, the Mother Lode, Gold, Placerville, and it had been completely stripped about 40 years ago, and it's grown back. And he's now wanting to just make sure that he doesn't, he does something with it to take advantage of the growth, but then thins it to do what he needs to. So.
Right, good. That's a good strategic plan. All right.
And by the way, he's just a young guy. He's just a young guy, 77. So he's going to.
Well, I tell you what, folks, I'm already late for a meeting here at the county, so I'm going to sign off. Thank you for being here, and I think it's 4 more weeks. 4 more weeks.
All right.